One of my listeners, Ollie, asked the question, and I quote, whether we are to believe these monumental performances. Well, in the past, some of the monumental performances were aided by drugs when doping wasn't illegal. Another way of framing this question is, do the best cyclists of today dope? Doping in cycling became illegal in 1963 and the first tests began in 1965. But cycling has a long history before then. Cycling races began shortly after the bicycle was invented. The events were huge, worthy of the Colosseum. One such event was called the Six-Day Race, which occurred in a velodrome. Cyclists competed to see who could travel the furthest in 6 days. The public came partly because of the noise, the crashes, and the spectacle, but also to see how the cyclists were being worn down near the end of the race. When riders looked like they were tiring and nearly falling off their bikes, their soigneurs or caretakers would often hand them a little black bottle to perk them up, leading to miraculous cures. Substances such as opium, morphine, and cocaine were unregulated and available to the public for ailments as minor as a headache. Some of the drugs were even more dangerous, with some riders being fed strychnine by their trainers. Some riders died at an early age, a recurrent theme in cycling. After 1912, drugs became harder to get, but races didn't become easier. The length of the Tour de France reached more than 5,000 kilometers. It is less than 3,500 kilometers these days, and for many years there were days with more than one stage. Famously, the Pelletier brothers complained to a journalist that they needed drugs to survive the race, when they were penalized for not carrying all their clothes with them, although many years later they said they were just teasing the journalist. Amphetamines, such as Benzedrine, were invented in the 1930s, but they weren't banned until 1960. More than one famous rider openly admitted to using amphetamine, saying, "You couldn't expect to finish the race if you didn't dope." Cyclists weren't tested for doping at this time. A few cyclists died and some had life-threatening injuries that could be traced to the use of dope. Things had to change, but even in those days some cyclists claimed that everyone was doing it, that is why they had to do it. That is also a recurrent theme in cycling. Doping itself was banned in 1963, so even if a substance was legal, say in a cough medicine, but its use improved performance, then its use in competition was banned. Testing for drugs started at the milk race in 1965 in England. 4 riders tested positive for amphetamine and were ejected. Testing has never involved the whole peloton en masse at any one time due to logistics. Usually, the podium is tested, as well as the race leaders, and a random selection of other riders. Testing drove amphetamine use out of the professional part of the sport because it was easily detected, although some riders confessed to still using amphetamines in the 1980s and even into the 2000s in amateur races where testing wasn't performed. Around this time, a team might suddenly leave a race, complaining that they had eaten something bad, usually fish. Because they left, they wouldn't be tested. Professional cyclists used to compete every week for relatively small amounts of prize money. A successful cyclist might retire after their career with enough money to open a tobacconist shop or their own bicycle shop. In the 1950s and 1960s, scientists worked out that these cyclists were becoming anemic and their bodies were breaking down due to all the competition. amphetamines and other stimulants didn't deal with the real problem. About that time, testosterone and anabolic steroids started to be used as doping agents in sport due to the muscle building effects. Unlike stimulants, these hormones don't need to be taken during the race. Over time, agents were found that masked the presence of steroid hormones. If you tested only during competition, you would not necessarily detect doping unless the athlete was careless. To combat anemia, they tried blood transfusions in the 1960s, but Jacques Anquetil found that it did not improve performance. After the Mexico Olympics in 1968, high-altitude training became the norm for endurance athletes, because this solved some of the problems of anemia and gave a boost to performance. It is still a norm. Then, the Soviets discovered how to use blood transfusions to improve performance in time for the Moscow Olympics of 1980. By the Los Angeles Olympics in 1984, the US team had also learned how to do it, and shortly afterwards, blood doping was banned. By now, professional cyclists were being paid more and didn't need to compete every week, and they started to focus more on specific events. This started to occur in the 1980s. Of course, where cyclists competed less, they were less likely to be tested. Eventually, testing started to occur at random, both in and out of competition, to deal with this. Going back to blood doping, it needs to occur around the time of competition, and people are still using blood doping. This is because blood doping is quite difficult to detect, and sometimes it is easier to follow the trail of syringes, discarded blood bags, and fridges loaded with blood, or hope that someone makes a mistake by putting the wrong blood into the competitor, as has occurred on a few occasions. It is hard to do blood doping by yourself. There are also subtle aging signals in the blood that can point to blood doping. However, some of the highest profile cases never tested positive, but were convicted by the testimony of their teammates. This is reported to have occurred for Lance Armstrong in the early 2000s, who later confirmed it on television. In the late 1980s, an even easier way to boost blood was identified. Erythropoietin, or EPO, a hormone that increases the production of red blood cells, became available for treating anemias in 1989. EPO is a recombinant human hormone, so at first, its use couldn't be detected. Young cyclists started to die of heart attacks due to a combination of the thickening of their blood and their low resting heart rates. Some cyclists had to be woken in the middle of the night to do a training session just to keep them alive. You can measure the amount of red blood cells in blood using a hematocrit, and a value greater than 50% was used to remove cyclists from competition as a health test. Eventually, a diagnostic test for EPO was implemented in 2000, perhaps 11 years after it started to be used in competition. There are new compounds that can mimic the effects of EPO, and whether there are tests for all of them is an open question. To deal with the fact that doping does not need to occur during competition, blood and urine are tested at random spot tests. Since 2008, all cyclists have an athlete biological passport, which is an electronic record of all individual urine and blood doping tests, as well as a blood and steroid profile, which is used to detect any changes that might be due to doping. Athletes have to state their whereabouts months in advance so that they can be tested at random. It is generally held that Michael Rasmussen left the Tour de France in 2007 while in the maillot jaune, and nearly certain of winning, due to reports that he was seen in the Dolomites when he had said he would be in Mexico. His team withdrew him from the race. In 2011, the sponsor of that team, Rabobank, stopped its sponsorship of cycling, saying it was no longer convinced the international professional world of cycling can make this a clean and fair sport. The biological passport has been used to strip competitors of victories, including high-profile cases such as in the Vuelta a España of 2011, where Chris Froome was declared the victor in 2019. Another strong factor against teams being involved in organized doping is the attitude of sponsors, especially as the money in the sport has skyrocketed. There was Rabobank, as I mentioned before. Deutsche Telekom, a strong sponsor of the T-Mobile team, pulled out in 2007 ahead of schedule after a series of doping scandals. Team Sky made staff members sign that they had never doped or their contracts would be terminated. There are rumors of sponsors leaving a team when there is a doping scandal in another team. But individuals are still being caught doping. Interestingly, these are mostly in minor teams with smaller budgets. You may file that under things that make you go, How you might explain the observation could say something about how you view the prevalence of doping. In France, unlike many other countries, doping is not merely banned, it is illegal, allowing the police to begin criminal investigations, such as those that led to the Festina affair in 1998. Not only did the Festina team leave the race, protesting their innocence, but the peloton went on strike. In 2020, the team Arkea Samsic was investigated by the French police, although, so far, no actions have been taken, and this year, at the Tour de France, police raided the Bahrain Victorious Hotel. What the short history reveals is that doping still occurs, although perhaps not at the levels in the past. Given the reduced racing schedule and shorter distances of the Grand Tours, riders no longer claim they need to dope to be able to compete. The general mood of the public is also strongly against doping. To combat doping, the UCI and other organizations retain samples for testing for new compounds in the future, compounds that might have a therapeutic use for sick individuals, but which can improve performance in elite athletes. In addition, athletes have been banned for allegedly destroying sample vials or merely for not being where they say they would be for random doping control. Given all these factors, for a top cyclist to dope, it would require active involvement of the team, which would severely jeopardize sponsorship. I think it is unlikely to occur, but not impossible. This is a good place to stop. In the next episode, I will look at the likely limits of human endurance performance on a bicycle. Until then, thank you for listening.